Well, GOP candidates trying to become our 45th president keep channeling Ronald Reagan, comparing their principles to those of our 40th president. And here's a quick snapshot from just this weekend.
Ronald Reagan made us believe that it was morning in America again, and it was. Well, now the children of the Reagan Revolution are ready to assume the mantle of leadership.
As Ronald Reagan was to the presidency, so too was Justice Scalia to the U.S. Supreme Court. His passing, 1 week ago today, underscores the enormous stakes of this election.
Joining us now, Simon Rosenberg, president and founder of the New Democrat Network and a former campaign advisor to President Clinton, and David Webb, host of the David Webb Show on Sirius XM, Patriot, and Fox News contributor as well. Great to have you both.
Good morning.
David, I'm going to have to start with Simon here. I don't know if you know this, David, but Simon actually used the term children of Reagan in a note, Simon, back in 2014. So you're taking responsibility for this.
You own the name. I'll give you a nickel.
Okay, I was very flattered when Marco Rubio used that term, but it's speaking to something really important, is that you're seeing the rise of a whole generation of 40-something Republicans who grew politically of age when Reagan, this very powerful Republican leader, was president. And you're seeing with Cruz and Rubio and Walker and Paul Ryan, and this generation of Republicans are a significant force that Democrats are going to have to defeat if we're ever going to get back into power in the Senate, the House, and down below. So he's speaking to something I think really meaningful in this election.
You know, David, I'm reading the note that Simon wrote back in 2014, saying this is a group of increasingly successful and energetic politicians, a generation of politicians that, as he just mentioned on our air, is a formidable force for Democrats to face. But historical comparisons are tricky because they do conjure up a very specific image. And sometimes you can't meet that image, whether it's Joe DiMaggio, Elvis, or Ronald Reagan. So you think that this is... it's fraught, so you have to be careful with this. Tell our viewers why.
Yeah, you do, and this is a conversation I've had many years now with President Reagan's actual son, Michael Reagan, a good friend of mine. We've talked about it on my show over the years, that people are reaching back in the Republican Party, and I get it. I adore the presidency of Ronald Reagan. I have no shame in saying that publicly. The man was a great leader, great president. He and George H.W. Bush did amazing things to kind of recenter the 20th century on the values of freedom, of free markets. You know, he got so much right. His leadership is something to be referenced. But the Republicans continue to reach back. And it seems as if in every cycle, every candidate finds a connection. It's the word that triggers. But what does it speak to those 40-somethings, to Simon's point? At 40 years ago, they were 10 years old or so. They didn't know Reagan. They didn't live through the Reagan era. So that tricky comparison is to move forward and talk about the principles, less about the red meat name throwing.
That's an interesting question for Simon. What about that, Simon, to make the comparison but then move forward? And what about the fact that the candidates are picking and choosing different parts of Reagan that they like? It's not like the Republican Party saying this is the one unifying principle that we all stand behind. They each are choosing their own Reagan-esque policy that they say that they embrace.
Right. The most dramatic example of that, of course, is immigration reform, right? I mean, which Reagan was pro-immigration reform. The current Republican Party isn't. But I think look, I'm not surprised by this, in part because, you know, Ronald Reagan has been the most important Republican in the last 100 years of American life. He was a very successful president. He reoriented the Republican Party. And the contrast to that, to Nixon and the Bushes, who were largely failed presidencies. I mean, when you're a Republican looking back, you don't have a lot to pull from, frankly, other than Reagan. And so I do think that you'll continue to hear the Republicans be inspired by Reagan going forward, but in part that's a sign of the failure of their other major candidates over the last 50 years.
I had such hope for you, Simon. I had such hope for you. First of all, let me correct the record. There's a reason we now also have the Lincoln-Reagan dinners. I speak at many of them around the country. The presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush, by the way, followed Reagan first as his vice president, passing more legislation by the numbers, advancing many issues for many Americans. And yes, he is the most recent and important figure, but it's part of a Republican revolution that we need to see again. Reagan was kind of a 40-year revolution. We're in another cycle 40 years later.
Okay, so the question becomes then who is going to lead that cycle? Who does embrace Reagan in the way, David, that you say that could push it another 40 years or reinvigorate the party. Rush Limbaugh had some ideas about this. He had a specific name, a specific candidate that he says really does this. If conservatism is your bag, if conservatism is the dominating factor in how you vote, there is no other choice, Rush Limbaugh says, for you in this campaign than Ted Cruz, because you are exactly right. This is the closest in our lifetime we have ever been to Ronald Reagan. David, your thoughts?
You know, my job is to analyze the horse race, Jenna, as you do on a news show, not pick the horses. But in the Reagan Revolution, something more important than the man first occurred. Americans needed a revolution, so the people, the populism, the populace actually said, we need a change, and Reagan came in, and in his time, he fit the bill. The people have begun to change since the rise of the Tea Party movement, since the growth of populism, and more what I call traditional Republican values and the Reagan Big Tent approach. So we're evolving generationally 40 years later, and that's what's changing. And the person who steps in and captures that and wants to be not just elected but a leader will be that person. But you have to realize the electorate has changed, and in America we demand more now. Look at the changes.
We're not going to get a name, Simon. That's what we got from the answer. But a very interesting perspective, David, on this, that really the revolution is driving it, not necessarily the candidate.
We the people.
Okay.
We the people. That's what it's about.
That's very interesting, especially given the diversity of candidates on the GOP side. Simon, who do you think? Are you willing to name somebody that really you think is that next quote-unquote Reagan?
No, well, I don't think we know, because the Republican electorate is so unsettled right now, right? I mean, for all the hoopla about Rubio and and he had, Nikki Haley with him. I mean, if you look at one option, right, which is Rubio, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, where you saw them all together last week, that's the kind of party, I think, that we're one future for the Republican Party. But the future the Republican Party seems to be choosing is the future of Trump, right, which is a very different kind of style, a very different approach, one that I think is really fighting hard against this other emerging Republican Party. Certainly it looks today like Donald Trump cannot be stopped and is going to be the Republican nominee. Well, so we may have to wait, Jenna, for this next leader to come along.
And we'll see. Maybe the two images that are being put forward, or three or four or five, actually do merge at a certain point. This is part of the exercise, getting the Republican Party there. An interesting conversation. I'll be curious from our viewers who they think really embodies the next Reagan for the Republican Party. And Simon and David, look forward to having you back. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenna.